My guest at this time is Dr. Tom Coburn. He served 6 years in the U.S. House of Representatives and 10 years in the U.S. Senate. While in Washington, he gained a reputation for fighting wasteful spending and seeking to rein in government to its constitutional boundaries. He is now a leading figure in the Convention of the States movement, which seeks to pursue a constitutional method to amend our Constitution that does not involve the U.S. Congress. And Dr. Coburn, thanks so much for being with us.
I am very happy to be with you. I wish you a Happy New Year.
Thank you. Happy New Year to you, sir. And I think folks who follow politics quite carefully have heard of the Convention of the States provision and perhaps the Convention of the States movement. It's provided for in Article 5 of the Constitution. Explain what it is and why you think it's necessary right now.
Well, our founders recognized when they finished the convention, actually 2 days before they finished the Constitutional Convention, George Mason stood up and he said, "We've made an error." And everybody looked at him and said, "What are you talking about?" And he said, do you actually think that a government who would become a tyranny would tend to pass a limitation on that tyranny? And so they all agreed. They all kind of slapped their head and said, "Well, we got to fix this." And the way they fixed it was to give a constitutional right to the states to call a convention to suggest amendments. And that requires that 34 states agree that what those areas are. And then if they agree to anything, then that has to go to the states because they're just recommendations. And then 38 states would have to approve it. But having served 16 years in Washington, I see no other solution. Doesn't matter who's in charge. I see no other solution to returning the liberty and independent thought and freedom that is ours by starting to limit the role of the federal government. Remember that the enumerated powers were very specific, and the federal government has now just abandoned that. And the consequence is 60% of every state budget on average is not controlled by their legislature. It's controlled by bureaucrats in Washington. So I see for the future, this is what we must and can do.
So what specific topics or even specific amendments do you have in mind?
Well, lots. One is start making them fiscally responsible. The Republicans have proven that they're not. The Democrats have proven that they're not. So who is responsible in Washington? And the answer is nobody, because nobody in Washington wants to make the hard choices to fix our fiscal situation. So the first thing you could do is say you will have a balanced budget. And any time you go to borrow money, 2/3 of the states have to approve any significant sum that you're going to borrow in excess of a balanced budget. And you give them 10 years to do that, to get it balanced. But, it's not hard to balance our budget. You'll hear different people talk about that. But the General Accountability Office has said there's at least $450 billion of fraud, waste, and duplication a year in the federal government right now. There's at least $150 billion a year waste in the Pentagon. I mean, that's half of our deficit right now. And if we actually limited the federal government to its true roles, as outlined in the Constitution, you'd save another $600 billion. So, it's not hard to balance the budget. It's that the politicians don't want to make the hard choices.
And we'll get into some of those issues and choices a little bit later in our conversation. But just to give our listeners a clearer idea of what a convention of the states would look like, and when you say 34 states, the Constitution says 2/3 have to agree to convene, and then 3/4 would need to ratify. So that's how we get 34 to meet and 38 to change the Constitution. Would you have to have specific amendments for the states to consider? Could you just say we want the states to come together to address size of government, spending, that sort of thing, and then work on it from there? How does the process work?
You can do both. What we have chosen to do is give 3 specific areas that we think a convention ought to meet on. And anything outside of those areas, if you haven't asked for it, you can't do. So we've asked for fiscal restraint and responsibility out of Washington, which would mean you could have a balanced budget amendment. You could require authorization from 2/3 of the states to go in debt further once you have a balanced budget. In other words, you start making them make the hard choices. The second area that we think is very important is limiting the scope and jurisdiction of the federal government. If you read the Constitution, it says anything other than these enumerated powers are solely reserved for the people in the states. Well, the federal government's tramped all over that in various ways. So if, in fact, you redefined with an amendment the Commerce Clause to what it was intended to be by our founders, you would eliminate the authority of a lot of federal agencies to tell states what to do. And we're not talking about discriminatory practices or anything. We're talking about telling them how they have to measure when they're going to do their clean water. In other words, who's more interested in clean water in the state, a bureaucrat in Washington or the people who live in that state? So bringing the decisions back to state level where you can actually influence it as a citizen. As a U.S. Senator, I represented 4 million people, and I worked hard I had 100 town hall meetings a year. I tried to see everybody that came. But, basically I didn't see more than 5,000 people a year out of 4 million. Versus being a state senator, everybody in your district can get to you. So making the decisions made closer to home has a more responsive federalist and representative government tone to it. So you could do things in terms of limiting the scope and jurisdiction. And then finally, over the last 30 years, 80+% of Americans think we ought to have term limits on members of Congress. And the only people that don't think we should have term limits are people who are either lobbying Congress or in Congress or have been in Congress or want to go to Congress. And so why shouldn't we limit their terms? Maybe it's 12 years and 12 years. But to have somebody 35 years in Congress who has no connection with the real world anymore and has all the connection with the trappings of power in Washington does a disservice to the people they represent.
We're talking with Dr. Tom. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
We're talking with Dr. Tom Coburn, served in both the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. He is now very actively working with the Convention of the States effort. You can find more at Convention of States Action online. And one of the things I've noticed, obviously, with this movement, Dr. Coburn, is it's mostly conservatives who are pushing for a convention of the states. And while Republicans have done pretty well in recent years in controlling governor's mansions and, for this project, more importantly, state legislatures, 34 is a pretty tough hill to climb. So how far do you have to go? Is there a way you're also pitching this to Democratic-run legislatures to make this happen as well? How do you get to 34?
Sure. Well, we'll get to 34 as the conditions of our financial system get worse. And we have a lot of states, Ohio, West Virginia, Utah, where we have bipartisan sponsors. So, securing the future for our kids is a bipartisan issue. Socialism is a Democrat issue. You can't do both. And so I think the fiscal manifestations, here's an interesting point of view. There's something called the bid-to-cover ratio on U.S. debt. When the Treasury goes to auction T-bills or 30-year bonds, there's the number of people bidding versus the number of bonds that are available. 10 years ago was 3.8 to 1. It's 1.6 to 1 now. When that gets to 1 to 1, guess what happens to interest rates? They're no longer controlled by us. The Federal Reserve will have no power to control interest rates whatsoever. And so as people deem us unable to repay this $23 trillion in debt and $144 trillion in unfunded liabilities that's due in the next 50 years, they're going to want a very high interest payment. So all of a sudden, who that hurts is everybody in America except a millionaire. And so as that approaches and we start feeling the pressure of that, unfortunately, that may be too late. So the idea of selling a long-term view to our leaders in Congress, I know, is somewhat quaint, but that's what they're there for. They're not to win today's battles. They're to create a future for all of us, whether you're a Democrat, an independent, a socialist, an ultra-conservative, no matter who it is. Their job is to secure the future and create and continue this wonderful experiment in liberty and make it easy. We've fallen to the 20th most. We used to be number one in economic freedom in the world. We're now number 20. In other words, 19 countries, it's easier to start and run a business than it is in the United States. And so if anybody wonders why we don't grow regularly at 3 or 4%, all you have to do is look at the behemoth of the federal government, the rules, the regulations. You can't go one place anywhere to start a business. You have to go to 20 agencies to do anything. And so we need to change that. And that's why it needs to be brought back more closely to the very people that it impacts, which is at the state level, which is, by the way, our founders intended for most of the power not to lie in the federal government, but to lie rather in the state legislatures. That's why senators were chosen by state legislatures. They weren't chosen by the people. And that was to make sure the states weren't forgotten. And since we had the 17th Amendment, what has really happened, and further to that, in 1930s, the federal government has taken over most of the decision-making for most of the country in every level.
That's certainly the case. The 17th Amendment radically changing the way the government works and filtering all the way down to the state and local levels as well. This takes us back to a thing you said earlier, Dr. Coburn, that I want to address, and that's that neither the Democrats nor the Republicans seem to have any interest in actually addressing our fiscal mess. When you were in the House, an effort was started in that direction. We actually got to projected surpluses, and by the time Republicans had control of the House and Senate and the presidency in the mid-2000s, there were big deficits again. President Obama and the Democrats took them up over $1 trillion, and now with Republicans in control, or at least the last 2 years, we're projected to $1 trillion deficits again. Why isn't there an interest in either party, a serious interest in getting this under control?
I think leadership in Washington has changed. And there wasn't a serious interest except when the class of 94 came into Congress. And what nobody recognizes is that class in 94 did the first rescission of expenditures that had been done since the Dwight Eisenhower years. And we cut $58 billion per year out of the discretionary budget in Washington. And if you measure that from 94 to 2000, when we had the true first real surplus, the reason we had that is because that 54,000 manifested to about $1 trillion over that period of time, 54 billion to about $1 trillion in terms of the compounding and the savings that wouldn't be spent because we cut all those programs out. So to answer your question is, it's not popular to take dependency away, whether it's a federal bureaucrat or a state agency or somebody who's milking the cow in a private business. And so the number one goal of most people in Washington is to get reelected. Their perception is if I can't get reelected, I can't do any good. But the fact is they spend all their time trying to get reelected rather than doing some good. So I don't think it's hard to balance our budget. I can show you multitude of programs that are duplicative, and the government accounting office says they don't accomplish anything, and they have billions and billions. You know, we spend $15 billion a year on federal job training programs. You know how many of them there are? There's 41 federal job training programs. You know how many of them actually accomplish the goal that they're mandated to do?
Not 41. Zero. Wow.
No, zero. And what they're good at is employing people in job training, but not giving somebody a life skill that would make them non-dependent. So, and the reform was they eliminated 3 of them. That was the reform. With no metrics, no mandates, no nothing. So that's the kind of reform you get, because guess what? All these people who are in the business of federal job training and all these state and city agencies that get the dollars didn't want those dollars to go away. So they didn't take them away. So we're at a point where we can't trust Congress to make the hard choices unless we do something like we're recommending in the Convention of States. Force them to make hard choices. You know, it's easy for me to say I would much rather spend $5 billion securing our southern border than waste $15 billion a year on federal job training programs that don't work.
We're talking with Dr. Tom Coburn, again, served in the House and the Senate, now with the Convention of the States Project. And there's so many different ways we could go with this, and I look forward to future conversations. You mentioned the duplicative programs. I'd love to go into different areas of the government in addition to what you talked about with job training to highlight exactly how common of an issue this is. Also look forward to getting into how to peel back, not only to get to a balanced budget, but to peel back $23 trillion in debt over time and to improve our rating around the world. But in our last few minutes here, sir, I want to get into some comments you made recently about how to fix the healthcare system. Republicans, of course, were horrified by what happened with the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. And now Democrats pretty much accuse Republicans of the current state of the healthcare system because of a few changes made with the tax law and some other things over the past couple of years. But pretty much very few people like where we are with our healthcare system. And you believe that a big reason for that is because we don't see the bill. We don't know exactly what we're paying for. And when we're making healthcare decisions and it all gets funneled through insurance or some other program, could be run by the government. But explain why you think getting back to that system would be beneficial to salvaging our healthcare system, and what else is critical in that effort.
Well, that's a long topic. I'll try to summarize quickly. We spend $3.6 trillion on healthcare a year in this country. Multiple studies say that at least $1 trillion of that doesn't help anybody get well and doesn't prevent anybody from getting sick. So the first thing you have to say is, why does 30% or 28% of everything we spend not help anybody? And the answer to that is there's tons of middlemen in healthcare. There's the insurance company. There's the drug package company. There's the drug companies. There's the for-profit hospitals. There's the not-for-profit hospital. There's the supplemental programs. Everybody wants some of the medical dollars. But the one thing that's lacking, which is different than every other area of our economy, is you don't know what you're buying. You can't see quality parameters and you can't see price parameters before you buy it. Now, I would put forward that almost everybody else in the country, before they buy anything, want to know what the price is and what the quality is. And until you start mandating that price transparency is available to the individual who is consuming the process, we're going to continue to waste a fourth of the dollars that we spend on healthcare or more. The other thing that's going to happen is, wouldn't we want to incentivize excellence and punish poor care? So if, in fact, people publish their prices, whether it be a hospital, a doctor, a pharmaceutical company, if they publish their prices, what happens is you get to know beforehand. Lots of people go in for a routine procedure, and for 2 months they get bills from everybody other than the person and the place they went to, whether it's an anesthesiologist or somebody who read an x-ray or somebody who did some lab. Nobody knows what's happening, and it's not hard to figure out. And in Tulsa, Oklahoma, we have a firm that works with other businesses called Medisys, and they give them the best price for everything in the city. And then they incentivize their employees to go where the quality is good and the price is good. And multiple firms are saving $250,000 a month just off the fact that price transparency changes behavior. So this isn't hard to fix. But there are all sorts of things, from hospitals 30 days after you left filing a lien on your home. There's one hospital in Fredericksburg, Virginia, that has a lien on 80% of the people in the town of Fredericksburg. Wow. Well, think about that. And that's supposedly a charitable hospital. Think about the fact that when you go to pick up a prescription at a pharmacy, and if you use a chain pharmacy, you're actually going to probably pay more if you use a private pharmacy. But you have this drug provider, a pharmacy benefit manager. And the one thing everybody ought to ask is, what's the price of this if I don't use the pharmacy benefit manager? Because in a lot of instances, you can buy that generic cheaper and have less money out of your pocket than using your insurance company. But people don't know it because prices aren't there. So why should the middlemen in America, whether it be the insurance, Blue Shield in California is sitting on $8 billion worth of cash. They're a nonprofit. Why haven't they cut their rates? There's lots of reasons, and it's because we don't have a real market in healthcare. And we have all these middlemen that take advantage of the middlemen that are there, so you pay more. And remember, it costs you as an employee working at a plant. If your health care bills are going up, that's money that's not going to come to you for a pay raise. If the money your company is spending on health care is rising at twice the rate of inflation, that means you're going to get half as much in terms of an increase the next year. And so we ought to want to solve this. And the way we solve it, every other area in our country, is markets. Transparent markets where people can make a decision. And people say, well, people will fall through the cracks. You think they're not falling through the cracks right now? They're falling through the cracks like crazy. And they're getting liens placed on them, their wages liened. All sorts of bad things are happening to people, not of their own fault, but because we don't have a market-based system that tells them what they're getting ready to pay. So I hope that makes some sense.
It makes a tremendous amount of sense. We have about a minute left here, and I know it's not fair to ask you this, to explain all this in just a minute or two. We can go 2 minutes, certainly. And that is, most of what you said didn't really relate too much to government, although towards the end when you talked about having a robust market, obviously the more government regulation you have in there, the less free of a market you have. So what's the right role for government here?
The role for government is to get out of the way and mandate price transparency. In other words, say, if in fact you're going to participate in any of the federal health care programs, whether that be VA, Medicaid, Medicare, Medicare Part D, anything, if you're going to participate at any level, CHIP program, with federal government dollars, you are mandated to put out so anybody can see what the price is for any CPT code you're going to do on them. And no, hospitals don't want to do that. Matter of fact, they sign contracts with insurance companies that they can't tell anybody what the insurance company is paying them. It's called gag clauses. Same thing with pharmacies. This was just changed with the middleman putting gag clauses on the pharmacists to tell them what the price is. So it's easy for us to fix this. We just need to have the government say, if you want to participate in when 1/3 of the health care, then you got to participate by publishing your prices. And what will happen is once prices are published, you'll have all these apps developed which will tell you where the best price is. And then in about a year and a half, because people want to differentiate between themselves and somebody else that's doing exactly, then all of a sudden you'll see outcomes published. So not only will you see price, but you'll also see quality. And I want to go to the best doctor, not the worst.
Me too.
And I want to know what I'm paying before I go to the doctor.
Dr. Coburn, whether it's healthcare, our national finances, and the constitutional boundaries of government, really look forward to talking to you again, sir. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for your time today. Okay, I'll leave you with one thing. There's 224 science, math, engineering, and technology programs run by the federal government. Just think about that. Till the next time we talk. I will, and I look forward to the next time. Hope it'll be very soon. Thank you, sir, again for being with us. See you later. You bet, Bye-bye. Sir. Dr. Tom Coburn served 6 years in the House of Representatives, 10 years in the Senate, and now a leading figure in the Convention of the States movement. I'm Greg Columbus, reporting for Radio America.